now back for episode 20 of Pursuing the Perfect Pint podcast. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about Australia's success in new barley variety development. So stay tuned to hear more about that. But before we get into that, Brent, what's happening in the world at
Uh,
large?
I guess, episode 20. So we're quite excited about that. We're really growing up. The market's still really dominated by the news in the Middle East. And I guess the biggest challenge, Danielle, is it's just the high level of uncertainty. One day we hear good news that maybe things are calming down, but it doesn't last so long. And we just see kind of a whiplash effect that it goes the other way. So at the moment, we're doing this on the 20th of April. It looks like things are heading in a slightly more positive way, and that maybe brings some of the calmness I mentioned. But and we've had some discussions with people. I guess with amongst all this uncertainty, I guess the one thing I thought of, and we talked about it in planning for this, with risk of higher fuel costs, but and more importantly, higher fertilizer
Yeah.
costs. Barley could do quite well in this scenario because barley is a lower input crop, and we know farmers will make rational decisions. And if they want to save on expensive fertilizer input cost, one crop that they could
Yeah.
marginally shift into would be barley. So there might be an underlying positive story, but to answer your question, this is all about the Middle East and the disruption that's really been hanging over. It's 7 weeks now, and it's just been 7 weeks of uncertainty and risk of higher cost, which is not good for farmers, but it's also inflationary, as we talked about. So,
Yeah.
it seems like a broken record, but it's today the market's really, really focused upon the Middle East.
I mean, Brent, you see a lot of articles at the moment saying people they don't think people are fully costing in the impact of the crisis. What do you think in terms of how it's being reflected in barley prices or not at the moment?
It hasn't been. Maybe the one area that we see, maybe it's starting to have, well, there's one big immediate influence is right now, I would say, and this doesn't have any limits geographically. I would say around the world, farmers are not active sellers of barley. They've sold a lot of crop 25, so the last crop, they've sold a lot of it, but they're really not motivated to sell anything for the upcoming crop
Yeah,
that's being planted. And I think that's a very clear
good
indication that
point.
if they're going to have to spend a lot more on fertilizer, then they would be potentially locking in losses at these levels. So they're really holding off. So this lack of farmer selling is kind of across every geography. Everyone I talk to, it almost is a common refrain. It's farmers are not selling. I think that's one of the big immediate impacts of this is a lack of liquidity from farmers. So it's holding prices up a little bit. Maybe if we get some calmness in that, it would maybe start bringing more active farmer selling to it. But right at the moment, it's probably more farmers are being very cautious, which is understandable.
Brent, yeah, that's a very good point around lack of liquidity because the farmers are playing a bit of a wait and see game.
Yeah, which makes perfect sense. I think we would
Yeah.
all do the same if we were a farmer, and I think the price levels that they see currently with the risk of higher inputs is no motivation for farmers to be active sellers. So that's to your earlier question. I guess that's the biggest thing hanging over the market is just this the implications of things in the Middle East does come back to impact barley. Maybe positive in one way, but from a cost perspective, there is some risk as well.
Makes sense. And Brent, as we move away from the global barley pricing, if we go back down under to Australia, where you had a very interesting conversation with Paul Telfer from AGT. Let's hear more about that.
Okay, well, now we're going to take in a way, a virtual tour to Australia, but not really because we're sitting here together in Lisbon. But Paul Telfer is here from AGT. You can explain a bit of what that is in a second. But first of all, thanks for getting here with all the travels and the adjustments required. So good to catch up with you again. So maybe we'll start with maybe just a really brief introduction of what you do, what keeps you busy during the day, and AGT. What's your prime purpose in life as a business?
Thank you, Brent. It's good to be here in Lisbon. And yes, it is a very, very long way, so it's a significant effort to come across here, but it's great to be here. So I'm from Australian Grain Technologies, or AGT, and we're a company based in Australia that develops new varieties of wheat, barley, canola, and lupins. And I'm charged with running the barley breeding investment at AGT. So my day-to-day is overseeing the breeding program that we have there at AGT, and also working with industry to work out what we need in our new varieties.
Yeah. Well, I guess we were just doing some chats preparing for this. If we looked at the outcome from the recently well, not so recently, but the crop 25 result, we have a big crop. So, and I think you've got some thoughts around some of the variability within that. But the point I was raising, Paul, was when I look at the long-term trend for Australian barley production, it's a very good story. Like you look at the last 10, 12 years of barley production in Australia, it's on a very good upward sloping trend line. And there's a lot of climate variability, and we'll talk about that some more. But I think it's a testament to the work that you and others, your peer group in Australia and elsewhere in the world, of course, is that we have a pretty well-established pipeline of new varieties that are beneficial to the farmers. They fit the brewers and distillers' needs in the world, and so on. So my general thought overall is we're in a pretty good place. But so I'm not just saying that because you're here, but I'm saying that because you're here. But I think we could take a step back and feel that we should feel pretty good about where we are.
Absolutely, yes. So the crop 25 in Australia was quite a good result. For some areas, particularly Western Australia, was an incredibly good result with a record harvest. But it wasn't smooth sailing across the production regions in Australia, with some much harsher conditions and lower rainfall conditions, particularly in South Australia and into Victoria. But as a whole, it was still a really good result. And it is a very good point that the farming systems in Australia have become a lot more robust, and even in the face of some of those significant challenges and low rainfall conditions, we still had a relatively successful crop, particularly in South Australia, where I'm from. It was, given the low rainfall, a very successful crop. And of course, as a breeder, I'm going to be biased in saying that we've had a significant play in that. But it is true that we have, but it is a combination of the new genetics coming through in varieties, delivering that value to growers, in combination with new and improved farming systems. And those two intersect. And it's very true, over the last 10 to 20 years, events like the 2025 and 2024 growing seasons were detrimental going back 1 or 2 decades. But the last couple of years, yes, there's been a bit of pain for some growers, but as a whole, it's still been a really good result. And for Australia as a whole, last year was a very good result, absolutely.
Yeah. A record crop. So
for Western Australia, absolutely.
Yeah, and and in total, and I think with some variability, because the climate was doing its usual, throwing challenges at in different parts of the world. There's a difference between northern New South Wales and southern New South Wales, as you mentioned when we were prepping for this. So I guess the way I summarize that, Paul, is I always come back to, I think there's a very well-established and a good pipeline of varieties coming from companies like AGT and your peers, as we said, and in conjunction with you, as you mentioned, no-till is now the standard in Australia. Like 20 years ago, there was be a debate of whether you should do it or not. But so there's the farming practices is continuing to develop and be enhanced, and you add those genetics like you talked about, and it does put you in a pretty good place. It's good for the farmer, good for the maltsters and the brewer. So we are in a pretty good place. I wonder, can you keep it up? Would be the one thing in terms of, like, we're going to need this to continue, because it's always a race. Farmers are going to need that, especially when we get into some topics we'll talk this week. Like we have a very low malting barley premium that we're showing to farmers. That, in my mind, that's a risk, because that's really telling farmers that we really don't have a big value on malting barley over feed barley. And for us that are interested in beer production and whiskey in that sense, it is something to think about. The work you do and others and the farming practices, they all help, because that helps the farmer come out, to your point, with a slightly better outcome than they would have if they wouldn't have been doing the practices or they didn't have those genetics available. So we're in a good place. I don't think we can't rest on our laurels, and we can't take some time off. Like what's your thoughts as you look ahead in the development? Is the investment there, and the commitment, of course, is there? How do you see it? Because we're talking this week about the decade ahead. So what's the decade ahead look like when you think of it?
Well, that's a really good question. There's lots of components in there. So firstly, you asked, can we keep doing it? And I'd like to say yes we can. There's no indications as yet that the genetic gain that we have been achieving in recent years is going to slow down or stop. But that is largely as a result of the significant investment that we have, not only in Australia but around the world, about continually looking to improve our breeding methodologies, bringing in new technologies. How we breed these days is so different from 10 years ago and almost unrecognisable from what we were doing 20 years ago. So yes, I think we can keep on doing it, but that's not to say it's going to be easy. But it is that investment in breeding that is incredibly important. We've got a really good system in Australia with endpoint royalties that provides a really good value capture mechanism, but it is also incredibly important around the world. And being able to integrate across the value chain is really important. And I know myself as a breeder, that is actually one of the things that I find most interesting and most rewarding, in that I get to sit at the intersect of working with growers, what growers need, understanding what their requirements are now and into the future, industry, what they need now and into the future, but also then working with the universities and the research departments around the world to bring that foundational research in to keep delivering that value as we go forward. So to put a positive spin on it, there is still a lot of opportunities out there to keep delivering that value to industry. It's
kind of the tide floats all boats. So as everyone collaborates and keeps improving, then that's just going to help overall. Maybe Claire, so people that maybe don't, endpoint royalty, which you touched upon, is basically a system that as that barley is grown and then as it's marketed, there is a small fee attached to that finds its way back to a pool of money that's reinvested into the development for companies like yourselves and others. So it's kind of perpetuating like a self-funding in a way, or it's contributing at least partially to the funding of this, which means otherwise if it was left to fully commercial terms, then and it's tried in other parts of the world, it can be a bit difficult. So that you're saying that endpoint system is good because it's providing that investment opportunity.
Absolutely. There's a few reasons for that, in that it provides a really reliable way of being able to capture the value that growers see. So if we're delivering varieties that have improved grain yield and improved productivity for growers, they're getting more tonnes. Yeah. Therefore, we're going to get a greater return on our investment, and we can invest that straight back into delivering that value to growers. So it's different from many other regions around the world who, in terms of breeding investment, will collect their fees up front, where we are solely reliant on the success of the growers and what they can achieve to then reinvest that back into breeding efforts.
And farmers can see a good yielding variety from far away, and that's the whole. So you earn your way through that, right? So varieties that are developed, and farmers pick it up, and they'll pick it up fairly quickly, I would say. I think there's a bit of a challenge that we need to think about in the decade ahead. Is the pace of change fast enough from the brewers and distillers' perspective? Because they have always been rather traditional. I guess I would say today they still are. So they're maybe not quite as fast. They have procedures to go through and all that, and everyone understands that. But there's going to be a need also, and if we talked about this, and we will this week, around there's things that we need within the industry, and one of those things would be an ongoing willingness from brewers and distillers to look at the pipeline as early as we can to get those new varieties that you're developing and others, get them into the system, get them tested, and get them commercially rolled out. And the job never ends, because as soon as you get a new one put in the system, you're already working on the next one, which is this continuous improvement thing, which is getting us to the point that we see this pipeline looking good. So the system is definitely doing some good things.
Absolutely, and I think it's also important to recognise that yes, we can often see that the malting and brewing industry can be very traditional, but breeding, although has increased in its rate of being able to deliver new varieties quite significantly in recent years with new technologies, it is still a long pathway to market. From inception of cross through to full commercial success of a variety can still be a decade. Yep. So it's still very, very long cycles. And for us to be able to work in with industry to understand what is going to be required a full cycle in advance is a challenge, but also, I guess, reinforces that need for us as breeders to have strong links throughout the supply chain to understand what their requirements are now and into the future, so we can keep delivering that value to the industry.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned it before. I think the breeding community continues to improve and consider to move forward. I guess, and we talked about it briefly a bit before. We're focused a lot on sustainability and those ag practices, and we talked about regenerative agriculture or whatever term you use to describe it. I guess those efforts in that whole space of ag practices, how has that changed your approach when you think of how you develop varieties and how you look at all the different lines you have available? You have to think of it in terms of how they perform under current conditions and so on, but you also have to think how they perform based on the practices that are applied, because that will change. And I guess if you want to decarbonize and use less fertilizer or certainly produced fertilizer, then that has to be just another layer that you have to build into your approach.
Absolutely. So I think Australia as a whole and our producers have been very successful in bringing in new technologies to just maximise production, and in doing so have improved the sustainability of their farming systems immensely. You mentioned no-till. That was made significant gains in terms of efficiency of being able to produce their crop, but also incredible improvements in the soil quality and the being able to reduce significantly wind erosion and things like that. But also us as breeders, we need to be breeding for the performance of varieties within these farming systems. So we replicate, when we're running our trials, these same farming systems, so we know that the varieties we are producing are relevant to growers. But then on top of that, we talk about cost of production, and being able to produce the crop efficiently. And you mentioned fertiliser before. So we do see that the varieties that we are now producing are able to produce that grain yield just more efficiently. And that all comes down to the basis of this sustainability that we need for the industry. And
potentially a cost savings for the farmer, which is going to help on the margin. That's going to make barley look better in comparison to alternatives.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, we've also got things like disease resistance. We need to manage these diseases so that the yields remain, so that the crops remain high yielding. But we also need to be able to sustainably use fungicides and herbicides. So having the right disease resistances and the right agronomic traits in our crops, such that they can help farmers to most optimally produce their crops on a low-cost basis, but also that ties directly into what we know as sustainability, and it's really important.
And protecting them from whatever climate throws at you.
Absolutely, yes.
So when we tie that all together, we're doing some great things to help farmers to stay committed to barley, and barley is well positioned in Australia. You see it through a record volume crop, even with some variability. So I guess, and we'll definitely have the brewers help along the way in improving and commercializing these varieties. So this is all aimed at the end of the day, and maybe to wrap up, I guess the idea would be, this is all aimed at the end, and the podcast is about pursuing the perfect pint. So you are helping contribute to the farmer growing a malty barley, which is going to end up in the beer production. So if you were going to enjoy a beer, I guess my question ultimately gets to, what does a perfect pint look like if you're in Adelaide area or north, or in a certain place with certain friends and family? What does a perfect pint look like for Paul?
I think it's a couple of things. Firstly, it's the one that I have in my hand at that point in time. That's always the perfect pint. But it's always about the people and the situation that you're enjoying it with. Sitting around a fire or a bonfire, having a couple of beers. It's hard to get much better than that, but just enjoying it with friends.
So living in the present, and I think most people get to that. Beer is such a socially related product. That we are social animals as humans, and
Indeed.
And I think beer is just one of those connectors in a way, because you can have a beer. So I think what we'll do is this week we'll definitely share a beer. So Paul, thanks for
no worries. Thank you very much.
Good to see you again, and stay tuned for more. But until next time, we're out pursuing the perfect pint in Lisbon. Stay tuned.
Brent, that was fascinating. I mean, the results that Australia have achieved with their barley program year on year, and the growth is quite incredible.
It is, and I guess we should say, Danielle, there's a lot of good work being done around the world on variety development, so that there's a lot of good things going on. I think Australia is particularly an interesting one because they've had a lot of climate challenge. If you go back 7 or 8 years, where in some parts of Australia they didn't even plant crops because it was so dry.
Yeah.
So just that reality of climatic change, and I always describe it, the pipeline of new varieties has developed in a very, very positive way in Australia. They had a record crop last year in 2025, so you can actually see the output of that is very positive. And all the things Paul talked about is the system's right, how they get paid, royalties, helps the reinvestment and so on. So as I say, there's lots of examples of other really good things being done. I thought it was really important that we took a moment to look at a success story, and of course, if we can get to the same place everywhere else in the world, then Barley would be in good shape in the decade ahead, as we've been talking about.
Absolutely. And I think the other interesting thing for me is you also talked about the fact that the farming system has to succeed. So you can't just do the breeding if the whole system isn't supporting that, be it the in-point royalties or how farmers are planting and managing their crops. So yeah, a great success story all around.
And you'll remember, Danielle, from our time, some of the functional needs from the barley in malting and brewing, they're different domestically than maybe if you're exporting that barley into Asia, including China. So then you have to have a range of varieties, or you have to have the functional ability of those different varieties to adapt to the different needs for the market. So I guess we can look at that as also been in a good direction. So I think Australia's exporting a lot of barley, record crops. There's a lot of things that are really clicking in a positive way.
Brilliant. I think we needed some good news, Brent, after the stuff that's going out.
Yeah, for sure.
And next week, Brent, we turn 21. That's exciting.
Yeah, and I think what we'll do, our plans is, Danielle, maybe we'll stay in the Southern Hemisphere, but we'll swing over and we'll hear from our friends in Chile at Maltexco and a little bit of what's going on there. So I guess we continue to move around regions of the world, and hopefully people enjoy the virtual tour of the world.